Before we dig into the rest of the plumbing, let me just mention this black plastic in the crawl space. It's a vapor barrier, and it's simply creating a place for the water to condense before it gets up into the crawl space. That is, the groundwater will condense and remain on the bottom side of this 6 mil visqueen. Now, we don't expect any water down here since we did so much drainage work around the perimeter before we put the foundation in, but just in case, it's still a good idea, and it is a code requirement to have a vapor barrier in your crawl space. Now, before we move on into the details of plumbing the water system into this house, we've uncovered a few more pointers from Phil about the sewer work that he did for us.
Well, it sits out in the sun, and you're trying to lay a straight pipe, and it's got a big old bow in it. So, like, see how nice and straight this whole run was? But if it was, you know, if you laid the black pipe on the ground, even if it's on flat ground, sometimes it just bows up like a banana.
So it makes the install hard.
Yeah, and then you're always strapping it to straighten it and then goofing with it.
Whereas white, you just know it's going to be straight.
Well, that's better, but I think black is quieter. And so when you have a toilet coming down a wall in your front room, sometimes we'll put a piece of cast iron in the wall just to keep the noise down. Really? And I don't know if it's any quieter black, the ABS over PVC. But, you know, I run on rumors. That's where I get most of my information. Talk about lining up fittings as you go down the road. We have these seams from it being molded, and these little notches on here. And they can be used. If I want this fitting to stand straight up and down, I'll line up this with that. If I wanted to roll the Y on its side and come in like that, we can line up these marks to get an accurate angle degree of some sort. And even the seam here dead center will line up with things. Anyway, that's a point of interest. These little notches are for a reason. And on the pipe itself, you got all this writing. It's all down the road straight. So we can line up the fitting, and just doesn't have to be perfect, but at least you know that if you get 20 feet down the road, you know that this is up compared to where that fitting was. Even if you rolled the fitting over on its side, and that's how it was, you might have one of these notches lining up. So what I'm getting at is the writing on the pipe is a straight line to match up with these marks to help you sometimes. When you glue this white pipe, sometimes it's best to twist it a few times as it sets, because it leaks far more than the black pipe. I mean, more instances of leaks with white than black, in my experience. You don't need primer unless it's high pressure water pipe, you know. And this has some primer built into it. It's wet dry, and it's fine for waste pipe. It takes too long to sit there and goop up primer on this stuff. It's unnecessary and no one does it. And then if somebody saw you doing it, they'd scoff at you. There's no pressure on this except when you do a test on it. Just gravity. So, you know, water pipe could have 100 pounds in it. Okay, am I doing this right? Oh, that's right. Important that you cut this stuff square and it's deburred on the inside. It's code. Shouldn't use a sawzall to cut it. We usually have a man that cuts it with a skill saw when I call out numbers. It's like doing a jigsaw puzzle with super glue. Every time you push one down, it's there. See, when you cut off a piece that has no writing on it, you're lost.
Yeah, you got no idea.
You got no idea what's happening after that.
Did you get it? You what?
Okay, we're going to do this one first. You kind of hold that. Don't get any glue on you.
No, heaven forbid.
Trapped it? Good job.
That's why it was so easy when I was a kid to plumb a house. You just run around.
Did he send you under there to work?
Oh, we grew up in this situational environment. See, I can line that line up with the marks on top. And then we'll eyeball it to that seam to there if we have pride in our work. And you have to hold it together. The stuff comes back apart.
Why does it push itself apart?
It's some sort of a, what do you call that? Quantum physics.
Quantum physics explains it perfectly.
I don't know. It does it.
I had that.
It has something to do with surface tension, I'm sure.
Yes.
We'll call it good. See, we can't really twist this one. Yeah, get that up there, a little bit down. It's about like that. Back in the day, if you're running copper or straight pipe, that's a nuisance. With the PEX pipe, you're getting this snake in there for contraction and expansion like we did in the ditch. So it looks like crud, looks like you have no pride at all. But it's functionally perfect.
Huh. We mentioned that plumbing comes first in the sequence of utility installation. And now, with the waste and vent in place where it has to be, and right on the heels of that process and using those tools and getting the grade right on the waste and vent, it's time to put in the hot and cold water lines. The water lines are much more flexible in their locations and where they can go and where they have to go, and so with that flexibility, he can put them in after the big pipe is where it has to be. When we installed these floor joists, these eye joists, we talked about the need to be careful when you're drilling or cutting into them. You cannot just think of engineered wood like it's an ordinary board. In any aspect of the installation or the fastening or anything else, before you drill anything, before you cut anything, before you establish any sort of a bearing condition, make sure it's okay with the manufacturer's guidelines. If these joists were 2x10s or 2x12s, Doug fir, full, ordinary, just the way nature built it, boards, you could dive right in for the most part, using a little common sense and trying not to weaken the board in a critical spot. But not with these things. You've got to follow the rules. Now the holes I'm drilling and pretty much everything you see Nate or I doing on the job site at this point is happening at the plumber's direction. We are helping and following Phil's instructions on how this system is to be installed. Not every contractor will want you being involved in his trade the way we are here. In fact, most would probably rather you're not even on the property while they're doing their work. But Phil's a good friend. He and I have worked together a lot on remodels and additions that I've done over the last 20 years, and so he's comfortable entrusting me with the, let's say, low IQ portion of what he's accomplishing here. You met Phil earlier when we put the sewer and drain lines in. Plumbers handle getting the water into a house and getting the water out of it. Now we've decided to use Pecks pipe to get the water into our house. Like everything else in life, there are trade-offs, but Pecks is a very good choice these days for water lines. It is affordable, it's proven itself to be long-lasting, and has demonstrated that it is a viable alternative to copper water lines. Okay, we're nearly home. That was so easy.
Hey, pull that out of there. See that little thing? That's where that went in fine.
Got it. The water lines are exactly like waste and vent in that it is so much easier to put these things in under a floor before the decking's on. In fact, it's almost the only option, really, because the inspector is not going to crawl around in the dark to see that the fittings are in place and that the supply lines are restrained. He's not going to do that, and since it's the same inspector on the same trip on the same day, we want to have both of these systems, waste and vent and water, hot and cold, in place, up to code, ready to be covered the day after the inspector says full speed ahead. We deliberated a long time before we decided to go with Pecks instead of copper in this crawl space. We're going to talk about that because there are lots of variables and lots of things to think about when you're making that decision. But having said that, whether it's copper or Pecks, they both have to be assiduously protected from friction, from rubbing, or from being, heaven forbid, in contact with the point of a nail that's been driven through the drywall or through a joist or through a stud and either penetrates the pipe or begins to rub and put a little spot on that pipe that, before you know it, is going to be leaking. And the leak will not be discovered until long after the water has done terrible damage. So protecting the pipe, regardless of the material, is priority one.
Well, copper isn't as great as you think. You know, it was all copper when I was a kid, but I'm changing out houses that are wore out. The copper, and you know, a lot of the times I see it in a recirc line where water's moving through the pipe all the time. Another thing is poor workmanship. If you don't ream the pipe to its inside bore and you solder it to an elbow, it creates turbulence as it passes that unreamed rough spot. And that turbulence can blow the back of an elbow out. And electrolysis, somebody will put in copper mixed with galvanized pipe and you get electrolysis and bonding where a building is grounded through the water pipes. And then they put a PVC line in from the meter. Now you don't have your proper bond or ground anymore. And then it kind of makes your whole copper pipe an anode rod.
You watched us put a water meter in here a couple of years ago, and then we came out of that water meter with a 1-inch line, put it in a trench, bedded it in sand, and brought it under the crawl space. That big line goes almost straight to the water heater and then splits into two systems, hot water and cold water, and leaves the hot water heater area in whatever way the plumber thinks is the most effective use of time and material to get it to the fixtures. Now note, every fixture in the house except a hose bib and a toilet needs hot and cold water. Not every fixture is going to use the same amount of water. So that large diameter line size can start stepping down as you go into the house depending on what fixture you're taking the water to. It's interesting that even though a 1-inch diameter line has about 3/4 of an inch of cross section in area, a 1/2-inch diameter line has quite a bit less than 1/4 of a square inch in cross section. So it's not a linear relationship. And when you go to half from 1 inch, you are restricting the volume a lot. And so that needs to be understood before you decide which fixtures can use what size service.
Hey Nate, that will come right to me. When you're sizing a water line, there's charts to go by, and some of it is manufacturer's information. Like the friction loss in one fitting over another. We talked about, you know, how little this fitting was over the expansion type. Well, the same line of pipes will have a different sizing from this style to this style. And, you know, I'll bet you 30% of everything plumbing, you know, getting a license is how do you size a building? How big are the pipes supposed to be? It's too involved for me to try to explain it. Another point about the expansion is if something goes through your pipe, like bark mulch, you break a pipe out there in the yard and some bark mulch goes through the yard into your pipes. When you turn it back on, it's going to catch on these fittings because it's a place for stuff to grab. It's kind of rare, you know, it don't happen very much. And a lot of times it'll, you can blow it backwards, like take the shower head off, put an air compressor in that guy, and if the pipe out in the street's open still, you can blow everything backwards and hopefully get it out. And I've done that before, didn't get it all out, and then you have these mystery problems. Back in the old days, someone's taking a shower and you flush the toilet and you heard the screaming. That doesn't happen if your piping is sized right, because you have enough flow. And that's where if you get a goodie stuck somewhere, you get these strange flow issues where something happens. And most of the time it's in the shutoff valves right under your sink. Yeah. Something will collect there because the pipes get chunked right down to the size of a little pencil. Yeah. From a 1/2-inch pipe, you know, something from this size down to little tiny. So that's what collects everything. So most of the time if you're having pressure issues, you take apart the shutoff valves under your sinks, you know, and then have your wife hold a bucket under them while you go turn the water on briefly.
Blow it out.
Yeah, I hope she got the bucket in the right place. But, you know.
We knew you meant
this complex corner. The rest is just a couple more keys.
I mentioned that the sewer and water lines are going to be inspected at the same time by the same inspector. Now, the water lines are pressurized by simply capping the ends every place that the lines are terminated for a future fixture, and then once everything's hooked up, turn on the water and you'll get city line pressure throughout the system in the house. Any leak is instantly apparent. Now, pressurizing the waste and vent system is a little different. We do that by lowering this balloon into the main line, blocking it off, and filling the balloon up with air so it is sealed pretty much watertight. Then we fill the whole thing, the whole system, with water, and in this case, I calculated that it took about 30 gallons to fill all of the waste and vent pipes. The pressure is ensured by this 10-foot riser, this pipe that sticks 10 feet in the air and is filled with water while the whole system is filled, creating 10 feet of head pressure, which is what the inspectors have to see your system withstanding without a leak before they can pass it off.
I saw your animal movie this morning. Right?
Oh yeah? What do you think?
The inspector called me up.
About this?
Called me a liar to my face. I didn't. He didn't plumb it. I did. I'm not a researcher. This is the part that might confuse me in
He
life.
told you didn't plumb it. That's hilarious.
Flat called me a liar. I guess we'll talk about the different types of Pecks, and I call it Pecks. I think that's just a brand name. There's Wurzbro, Openor, and this and that. I just call it Pecks, the plastic stuff. There's two types, and one of the recipes is type A, and then there's type B. And the type A recipe allows you to expand the pipe, and the pipe wants to go back the way it was extruded. In the B type, you want to use a clamp on it. It doesn't want to expand. They don't recommend you expand it onto a fitting. So the two types of fittings you got going on is the clamp type, the expansion type. And if you notice, the clamp fitting is very small inside diameter compared to the Uponor. You can almost put the fitting inside an Uponor. It almost will stick in there. The point is, the outside diameter of a clamp fitting is the inside diameter of the pipe. The pipe just goes right over the fitting, and then a clamp clamps it with a special tool that's calibrated to clamp it just the right amount. Now the expansion style, you have another, it's like a piece of pipe, but it's bigger. And you'd stick that guy over the pipe. There's a little tiny ridge on these collars that only let it go on so far. You saw us playing with this medieval unit in the earlier video. It goes in, and then you start pumping it, and it expands this collet. You'd also adjust this a little bit. You run it all the way tight and it expand its most. Or you back it off, you could adjust it a little bit. But every time you made a crank, you want to turn it so the lines wouldn't show up inside the pipe. So you pump, turn like that. Anyway, you get this thing expanded to where that it'll fit over a fitting. So now you've got the inside diameter of a Uponor is the same as the inside diameter of the pipe. And that's important when you go to size your water line, because you have friction loss through fittings. And so the friction loss through a clamp fitting is greater than with an Uponor fitting, obviously, because it's restrictive. Those are the two main differences between the types. But the pipe itself could be type A or type B. You don't want to expand the type B kind, just the type A. But you could put clamps on the type A kind also. The reason we use this guy in the beginning is because a lot of you folks are doing this yourself, and it's a lot cheaper to buy one of these than one of these when you're doing your job. This, if you notice the collet on it, expands, then it rotates just a hair. I hope you can see that. Yeah, it does that all by itself. So anyway, you get it going, it only goes in part way. Then you push it in, you push it in, push it in, push it in. Okay, that might be ready. When it's cold out, you might have to pump it a few more times. If it's a real hot, sunny summer day, fewer times. The point is, you can't just wait around to do this, because this is shrinking down the way it was made right now. start putting it in, and see, it won't quite go over that first. Don't try it. You get it halfway stuck on there, you got to cut it out half the time. Stick the fitting in. It went clear to the end, clear to this stop. You're fine. It's still loose, but it's starting to grab already. You get it in, it's starting to grab. Just get it out of there right away. Okay, now you're an expert. We'll be showing you a lot more detail on how to play with this stuff later on when we top out the house. This is just kind of give you a general idea of what we're doing. Going back to the copper thing, again, it's just expensive, and it's no better really. It's louder, you know, and I fixed more copper leaks than I have PEX pipe leaks. You know, 90% of the PEX pipe leaks I've fixed were mice and rodents chewing in it.
Yeah. But like you said, you've seen them chew through copper anyways.
Right, and it's probably not an issue to be crying about.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the numbers, very few get bitten, but you hear about them.
Yeah.
You know, the squeaky wheels get set out right away.
Yeah.
And what's the best water pipe to use? I don't know. Inconel X750 would be my choice, but it'd be expensive.
What's that? Is that a Pecks?
Oh no, that's an alloy used in high temperature turbine engines.
Yeah, let's not use that.
I don't even think you can get fittings. I don't know.
I wouldn't think so.
But, you know, since all the lead rules come out and everything, you can't even buy a lot of brass fittings anymore because of the lead content. And a 3/4 inch brass nipple 4 inches long is $6-10. Okay, back in the day, galvanized nipple, that was a nickel. Well, that was a long time ago. You know, but it's still a buck or two. So now they make stainless steel nipples, and they're cheaper a little bit than brass.
Yeah.
But the metal's harder, and you realize that when you screw threads together, they're tapered, they mesh together and crunch, and that's what makes the seal. And the stainless steel is harder than brass. So sometimes it drips more than other fittings. You got to put a lot of Teflon and goop and spit on it and tighten it well.
Do you remember, or do you remember your dad talking about, like, when there was a transition between galvanized and copper, was there whining and plumbers being like skeptical of that the way they have been maybe 20 years ago?
I don't know, because I was really short then. But doctors and lawyers had copper in their pipe, and their even sewer pipes, and because it was expensive.
Yeah.
But I think it was a joy to most plumbers because the torch wasn't unusual to them, because they heated lead to make sewer joints. So they had the torch going on all the time, right? So they kind of learned a little bit of, in all the tin work back in the day, you soldered the seams. So soldering was all inclusive in the general knowledge bank of a plumber. So I think they liked it probably because it was a lot faster than screwing pipes together. When you had something leaking down the road, hopefully you put a union over here to start unscrewing stuff to get to that one.
Yeah.
Real pain. But that's when plumbers were men.